Next guest is Dr. Lindsay Prendergast. She has served in schools and districts across the globe for nearly 2 decades as a leadership coach, consultant, principal, counselor, and teacher. She holds a master's degree in education administration from Colorado Western State University and a doctorate of education in educational leadership from Wilkes University. Dr. Prendergast currently serves as Assistant Director of Learning Experiences for the Danielson Group, the Framework for Teaching, while spending several post-pandemic years directly supporting nearly 30 principals as a leadership coach alongside Piper Lee. Lindsay spent hundreds of hours in classrooms observing teachers. These experiences, coupled with her expertise in instructional leadership and coaching, greatly informed the purpose and need for the book, which we'll talk about in the podcast. Lindsay enjoys advocating for educators by writing and speaking around the world for organizations such as ASCD, Learning Forward, Edutopia, AMLE, and others around instructional leadership grounded in student-centered schools where teachers thrive. Welcome to the podcast, Lindsay.
Thanks so much for having me. I appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, so I reached out because I saw that your book, which you co-authored with Piper Lee, "Habits of Resilient Educators," was a really good point to have you talk about that on the podcast
I
because
love it.
our theme is resiliency, right? So,
Yeah.
but we'll start off with the trench story. Tell me about a time when you were in the trenches and managed to crawl out.
Oh, wow. So there's so many, as I'm sure you can imagine, but certainly I think back to the time that always stands out is those days when we learned the pandemic was starting. I was in my first principalship at that point, and being in the trenches there, we were living internationally. We were in the Dominican Republic in an international school there. And that piece where we had students who were on travel for spring break at that point, scattered all over the world, who I never saw again, for example. But leading the school through that shift, hands down, one of the most humanizing, humbling, life altering experiences that I think I've ever had. It not only did it help me grow as a leader, but I think it really did help me situate my understanding of good leadership when you think about a school community and that piece that really centers it back around the human aspect of relationships. So that was being in the trenches in the thick of it there and testing your own moral and not moral, mental capacity and emotional capacity, but while also being really feeling responsible for that of others around you, was in the trenches is a perfect way to describe it. So
Definitely. And as I mentioned in your bio, you've since moved beyond that and done these observations of leaders and worked as a leadership coach. So let's talk a little bit about your current work as Assistant Director of Learning Experiences at the Danielson
yeah,
Group. For people who are not familiar with the Danielson Group, if you'd like
for
to share a
sure.
little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So the Danielson Group is the nonprofit that we work with the Framework for Teaching, supporting school leaders. And the Framework for Teaching is a tool that was actually a framework, if you will, that was designed by a woman named Charlotte Danielson about over 25 years ago. And this is a tool that is considered, it is actually one of the most widespread frameworks for typically for teacher evaluations. Its intent is really grounded in coaching and support of teachers for professional growth, but it's been adopted or adapted by probably at least two-thirds of the states in the United States and easily at least 30 different countries. So it's around. And if it's not the tool that's used for teacher evaluations in a state, there's been a lot of work on Charlotte's part to inform, for example, the standards for national board certification, the design of other states teaching professional evaluation standards, et cetera. So in that realm, what I do working there is partner with schools and districts that are really looking more at that system of professional growth for teachers, professional learning systems, if you will. So I design and deliver professional learning around the framework, but more so around teaching excellence, I would say. And similarly to that piece with coaching leaders on that of the implementation practices, the systems approach to building in a framework of giving those educators in every role a background for conversation rather than what we might would say in some systems everyone has their own kind of interpretation of what effective practice looks like, so nobody's really on the same page. This framework is really intended to ground everybody in a common language. So that is a really fun opportunity to work with that organization and supporting schools in that pursuit around the world.
Yeah. Yeah. And I want to just mention, so I've done a lot with the Principal Center, and the PD that's put on at the Principal Center centers around evaluation, using the
I'm
Danielson
sure.
framework. Although living in Colorado, we use a lot of
Yeah.
districts use the state RANDA framework. So,
Yeah.
but I mean, there are some similarities, and I think anybody who is looking for a good framework, if their district is adopting something or wanting to tweak some of their framework, to kind of look into that
Yeah.
with the Danielson Group. So as you mentioned, 4 years ago, you were in your first principalship. So how did that lead into transitioning into this current role with the Danielson Group after your principalship?
Yeah, sure. So coming back from the pandemic, we were actually we needed to move back to the United States. And as you can imagine, in that environment, wasn't necessarily ideal circumstances to start a new principalship in a school. And so I took an opportunity there where I could figure out a little bit of what my next step would be. And that entailed starting to work for the assessment organization, NWEA, as a
Okay.
consultant while I did my doctorate work. So kind of shifted away from the school role, thinking that would just be a temporary pause, figure all that things out, right? You have those little side steps and then go right back into school leadership. Ultimately, maybe moving into district leadership, et cetera. But I really started to kind of find a niche in that piece, and it was a pleasant surprise, but it hasn't changed me back. I haven't gone back to a school. So in that role with NWEA, which was really only up until about 4 months ago, I was positioned at a partnership with Clark County School District in Las Vegas, Nevada, and that's where Piper Lee and I met. And the two of us were leadership coaches, where we were assigned to specifically support principals, each in around 25 to 30 schools. These schools were identified as high need, not necessarily turnaround, but very high need for a variety of reasons. Early career principals in some cases, or schools that their data had really declined, and the district was just really struggling to figure out how do we help this. And it was a support approach. I used to joke I called myself an emotional support animal for these principals, but they're placed in the position to be leading these schools out of not only what we know of the interrupted learning experiences from the pandemic, but certainly the impact on just society and humanity as a whole. So the social emotional aspect, the mental health aspect of it all for teachers, for students, for leaders, et cetera. So it was really quite an incredible experience. But for 3 straight years, literally just walking the journey side by side as a thought partner, as a guide with these leaders of their schools, was pretty powerful and really brought to light to me the opportunities that you have when you're not in the building yourself to support those who are. And that's framed a lot of my work outside of my own job, my daily job, if you will, of getting out there and coaching and consulting and writing and speaking, et cetera, and really advocating on behalf of the people that are in the trenches.
So you kind of got that 360-degree view working with the schools that way.
100%.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
They're in the
So
pressure cookers.
yeah, so I want to talk a little bit about, so you have written the book. We'll talk about that in a minute, but you also do some web-based live shows. So you have a show called Educators Without Borders. So talk a little bit about that.
Sure. Yeah. So Educators Without Borders is one of those kind of a passion project, maybe like your podcast, if you will, meant to bring voices out there to educators in a way that they don't have to travel to a conference for, or they may have not have the opportunity to interact with these individuals in any other way. But School Rubric is another nonprofit that I do work as just kind of volunteer as like a hobby for. And
Okay.
so this show was designed to once a month or so. We were doing it more frequently, but just based on timing, slowed down a bit. But to bring a really kind of an urgent topic, if you will, in education. So case in point right now, teacher attrition, right? Whatever those current urgent topics are, but bringing several leading voices together, and not unlike a podcast, it's just a live show. So they're streamed, and then all those are recordings that live on the School Rubric website. So it's been a really fun opportunity to just get a ton of different perspectives audience members are able to come in live and ask questions during that time, etc. It's a lot of fun. That's a little just kind of a side project.
Mhm. And is that going frequently? Is that every week, or where can people
It's a
access
little bit on hiatus right now. We actually are in the process of generating some of those experiences and turning them into a book.
it? Okay.
So that's turning into a new project. Yeah,
Okay. Yeah. Yeah.
more fun to
So
come.
yeah, yeah. Let's talk a little bit about your book with Piper Lee called Habits of Resilient Educators. So on Corwin, it talks about the book shows a crucial relationship between teacher well-being and student success. So there's 9 habits there. And you are also under contract for a follow-up book, Habits of Resilient Leaders, coming in about a year.
Yeah, it's exciting. So this is a kind of one of those moments in your career or your life where you're thinking this really was fortuitous, and it kind of seems like it feels like it happened for a reason. That my colleague Piper and I were placed on a project together. We'd never met, and suddenly we were thrown into this very intense work of coaching these principals and their teachers 3.5 years ago. And so that journey led us to experiences where we were side by side with leaders conducting classroom observations day in and day out and day in and day out, and looking at instructional leadership skills to help those teachers grow. So pulling back from that, what we were constantly doing ourselves was having these conversations around, what is working, what's going well, why isn't it working over here? And just by virtue of happenstance, in a sense, having a constant little mini research project on the phone every day while we were processing what was going on and how to help these educators. So fast forward, and we have this opportunity to publish the book with Corwin. We designed it really as a result of synthesizing all of that experience and determining what did we see evidence of, what do we also know from our own background. You would definitely recognize call outs to Harry Wong's work in there, for example. It's a little bit of a blend of life skills and pedagogy, if you will, but to pulling it together in these 9 habits. And we say 9, there is a 10th chapter in the book that is exclusively around resilience and how all of the habits connect to resilience. Some people might call it a 10th habit, but it's its own separate kind of chapter there. But that's the kind of the evolution of that book. And it just published in February, but it's been really fun. We're taking it on the road this weekend. We're going to be in Vegas doing a conference with it. And yeah, and just immediately have been able to shift around and say, we can only influence teachers so much if the leaders themselves don't make changes in the system. Those teachers that read the book are not going to merit for, or not going to benefit from some of the outcomes of it. So we've been able to successfully get a contract for them. Exciting.
So, as you are working on that book that is under contract, are you planning on going back into schools and collecting more data, kind of doing another mini research project?
You can say so. Yep. So Piper is still working in that project. So she still is. And then in my role, I'm now doing the same type of work, but I am now traveling nationally and internationally to do that work. So much of the time I am in schools. Say, for example, I spent 3 days calibrating instructional rounds with a school in California a couple of days ago. So there is a lot of that. There's also an enormous amount of data, I would say, that we gleaned that we didn't use in the first book that we're pulling over into this one. And then just kind of building on our own experience over our careers too, for sure. And talking to a lot of people, not necessarily as supporting them in their buildings, but people that we know that are out in the field and just doing that powerful work.
So you also have written journal articles, as I mentioned in the bio, for ASCD and NWEA. So there's one as the time of publication, it will be out. And you talked about it's extending on the habits of teacher well-being, and it's called it talks about the myth of resilience.
Yeah.
So would you like to
Yeah, we'll be
highlight that
excited.
one?
For sure. Thank you. We'll be excited to see that one come out. We just submitted it for Corwin to share in their Corwin Talks
Okay.
journal. And this is a piece that is reflective of some of the reactions that we've experienced to the title of our book, Habits of Resilient Educators. What we've seen now is that resilience has been a word or a concept that's started to be a little bit toxic. A little bit of that message of positioning the problem as being back on the shoulders of the educators themselves, that if they would just fix themselves, everything will be fine, as opposed to recognizing that really what we have are systemic issues that are causing an environment in which teachers are working that is unproductive and unhealthy. And so we talk about that. We talk about the fact that the word resilience has now become in some environments a bad word, or, oh, here we go again. They're just going to pat us on the back, tell us to work harder, everything will be fine, right? And really drawing back to that there's a science to resilience. This is not a fly by night, it's going to fix everything. It doesn't remove the problem. It doesn't change the fact that there's going to be challenges and obstacles. It is a series of behaviors, practices, mindsets, as I know you know, that help you to navigate things when they get tough. Talks a lot about positive psychology in there, etc. And it merits learning what some of the science is behind it, and what those specific practices are, so that when we know things are going to not always be easy and they're probably going to stay challenging for a while longer, we really can put some things into place for ourselves to take care of ourselves.
Yeah, and it's not really just looking within your building or your network at your school or your district. It's really looking outside a lot of the time. I think there's a lot of educators that don't fill their bucket with non-educational things.
Right. So true. And I have been firsthand, I can tell you I've benefited from doing that myself, and it's helped me navigate when my work is challenging.
Well, we've had a great conversation today around your writing, your transition from principalship to consulting. Out of everything we've talked about, what's one thing you'd like listeners to remember?
I think my always takeaway that I like to share, and I sound a little preachy sometimes here, but is that we have been, as educators, positioned in many ways in an environment where it feels like we are alone and we have to take care of and solve all the problems by ourselves, and we're not. And so I'm constantly out there advocating that if you are yourself doing okay, it's time to turn around and reach your hand out for someone who's not, because we cannot do it alone. And so, case in point, experiences like connecting with you, we may be random strangers, but who knows, we might go down the road and do something together that helps some other educator or supports one another. It is a collective, and the only way that we can get ourselves out of some of the challenging situations that we're in as a field is together.
It's really important to remember, support those around you. If they're having a hard day, or even if they're not, just like if you, just show a little bit of empathy, I think, for your fellow educators. Well, where can people connect with you? Where can people find you?
Yeah, so LinkedIn for sure, on Lindsay Prendergast, just looking up my name, but our book website is going to be at edhabits.com. That's going to be a great grounding place where we're going to be building out community opportunities there for folks to talk about their own experiences, engage with us. We're going to learn from you as well. That's certainly going to be a great place to start as well.
Okay, sounds great. Well, thank you so much for being on the Out of the Trenches podcast today. It was a pleasure connecting with you and talking about habits of resilience.
The pleasure was mine, and keep doing your good work. I appreciate it.